I mean, I don't even know how you can dress this one up in any other way than, well, it's certainly at best, shall we say, disturbing. I guess if you had a defence barrister standing here, he'd say, hang on a second, he only mentioned Diane's colour because she talks a lot about that issue, so he reflected that. It wasn't racist to mention her colour, and the shooting thing was really a term that people use, you know, oh, God, I wish they, you know, I'd hang and flog it. Hang 'em and flog 'em. It's in that ballpark. I guess, Maurice, that will be his answers. What do you say?
You could be right. I mean, I'd be surprised. I'm surprised that anyone's trying to excuse these comments. To us, you couldn't get more obvious than sort of saying, "Oh, she makes me hate all black women, and she should be shot." I'm surprised there's not a criminal investigation. That feels like incitement to me, especially when you're talking about the most racially abused, the most abused MP in Britain, who Diane Abbott is, and you're suggesting, and to say in a public meeting she should be shot, that's beyond scary. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a stand-up. This is the interesting bit. A stand-up comedian could go there, and not specifically with Diane Abbott, but with MPs and talk about you know how horrendous MPs are and what should be done to them, etc. But we know well that MPs are targets. David Amos, Joe Cox, you know, there are examples of this, and frighteningly recent and horrific examples. And then, of course, you know, there's MPs whose homes have been, you know, attacked and people outside. Now, I know this was 4 years ago, 5 years ago when he made these comments. Doesn't really matter, to be honest. I think even in 2019, we were aware that if you're in a responsible position, like you're a donor, so therefore I assume if you can give away millions of pounds, you're worth a few quid. Don't know what this guy's job is, but it probably pays more than yours and mine put together, would be my guess. So therefore, he's in a responsible position. He's not he's not Ricky Gervais. He's not Jimmy Carr. He's not any of those people. So you don't go there, right? I mean, you just don't go there with, you know, even whether it was a white politician, a black politician, whoever. You don't go there talking about death and shooting MPs.
It's ridiculously irresponsible. And I think it's more. It's not just what he said. As you say, he's the Tory party's biggest ever, I think, donor, and he's given sort of 10 million quid to them. There's saying, you know, who plays who pays the piper, decides the tune. You've got, if you're given that much money and you have these opinions, this matters. This is the government. This is someone that's massively putting money into the government. Has these really. I mean, there's loads of Conservatives even coming out saying how appalling this is.
I don't. Yeah, I've not heard any Tory yet. I've heard a few say the classic. Well, I've not yet heard the comments. It's like, well, you have, because I've just told you the comments. I've heard that one, but I've heard very few try to defend it. The only thing I can think on this one, Maurice, is with the race aspect of this, makes me want to hate all black women. Is he trying to say that she just doesn't do a very good job of championing black rights or equality or ending racism because because of the kind of person she is, in his view, she actually has the very opposite effect. So I previously, you know, I love people of all colours, is his point. But when I hear Diane Abbott speak, she's enough to make me want to hate people who are exactly the same as her.
And this is a pretty unsavoury state of affairs, isn't it? I've got the actual comments that The Guardian says that Frank Hester made. He says he's talking about somebody that he really detests, a woman that he's presumably worked with. And he says, it's like trying not to be racist, but you see Diane Abbott on the TV and you're just like, you just want to hate all black women because she's there. And I don't hate all black women at all, but I think that she should be shot. That's what The Guardian says he says. If he did say that, do you think it behoves the Conservatives to give back the £10 million?
Of course. Two things are very obvious here. Firstly, the comments are as bad as it gets. Of course they were racist. He also said she should be killed. Mm-hmm. This is not small. This is huge. The other thing is the amount of money isn't small either. So the Conservatives are in real difficulty if they try and swallow this and accept it and say there's no problem here, because obviously there's a problem. They're also in real difficulty if they have to give back the money. They can't really afford to give back the money. It's so much money. It's 10 million quid.
Yeah.
They've got an election coming up. So
Yes.
this is a real...
Although Michael Crick was here in the first hour of the programme, and he said the opposite thing. He said the Tories have got lots of money.
Right.
You know, to them, £10 million is something they can easily afford.
Well,
and it was suggested by both my guests in the first hour of this programme that an idea would be a kind of compromise idea, if you believe in such things, would be to ring-fence that £10 million and for the Tories to use it for some kind of, you know, racial harmony movement.
Ultimately, they have to give the money back.
They have to give it back. Why do you think so?
I don't see how they can go into an election admitting that election is funded by a man who said these words.
Do you have to like and morally approve of your donors?
Well, I think your voters have to like and morally approve of your donors, or else you're in trouble. I mean, it'll be thrown in their face, and rightly, throughout the election campaign.
Really, do you really think the voters, the electorate, are that interested in where the money came from?
He said she should be shot. He was as racist as you get, and he said she should be shot. I mean, you can any Conservative MP who appears on television between now and the election will have to defend that, and should have to defend that.
Let me bring Ms Abbott into the discussion. Nels, thank you for joining us. Good afternoon to you. Let me just give you Diane Abbott's own statement here. She says, it is frightening. I live in Hackney. I don't drive, so I find myself at weekends popping on a bus or even walking places more than most MPs. I'm a single woman, and that makes me vulnerable anyway. But to hear someone talking like this is worrying. For all of my career as an MP, I've thought it important not to live in a bubble, but to mix and mingle with ordinary people. The fact that 2 MPs have been murdered in recent years makes talk like this all the more alarming. I'm currently not a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party, but remain a member of the Labour Party itself, so I'm hoping for public support from Keir Starmer. What's your take on the whole story, and do you think it's absolutely vital that the Tories return the money?
I think, of course, as the gentleman in the studio pointed out, of course, it's clearly racist of the most serious order. I think he should return the money. But you want to know something else? I don't really care, because I think that something deeper is going on over here right now. I think his house should be raided. I think he should be arrested. He should be searched. He should be thrown in a cell. He should be charged. He should be prosecuted.
But a man who's in receipt of hundreds of millions of pounds of government money, which to me is far more difficult, I think, for the Tory party to explain away.
Well, you know, there often is a connection between, or some people believe there's a connection between successful health technology companies and the health service and the political parties which run the health service at that time. Let's put it that way. But I've got a solution for Frank Hester. I mean, what he said was objectionable, it was silly, it was racist, even dangerous. I mean, you shouldn't talk about, you know, shooting.
Well, Rishi Sunak at least has said it was racist tonight.
Well, it took him a while. But I've got a solution for Frank Hester, right? You know, forget, you know, the apologies, forget Carter Rock, his very, very expensive company lawyers. What to do is to give, I mean, he's obviously, we say in Scotland, he's got more money than sense.
Yes.
So why doesn't he give...
But unfortunately, a lot of that money is ours because we've given it to him.
Well, possibly. So he could give some of it back. How about £20 million? Double what he gave the Conservative Party in one of the worst investments of all time, but double what he gave the Conservative Party to help job opportunities for ethnic minority kids. Barnett consequentials for Scotland, of course, as we would expect. So if he makes that big donation to demonstrate he's not a racist, that'll do him far more than denying it for time and
unfortunately for him, though, he apparently does already employ quite a number of people from various ethnic minorities and refers to them in what can only be regarded as a rather derogatory way.
It's time for Frank to make the grand gesture. And I've also got some more advice for Keir Starmer, you know, I mean, Diane Abbott, I defend Diane at every opportunity because she once voted against me being unjustly expelled from the House of Commons.
Well, nothing like loyalty, Alex,
well, exactly.
You well know.
So Keir Starmer suspended her from the Labour Party.
She's still suspended?
Yes, for what I thought was an ill-judged... I mean, well, firstly, it was ill-judged writing to the Observer. I mean,
that is an idiotic thing to do, You
know, sanctimonious pile of nonsense that it is. But nonetheless, I mean, it was... What she was trying to say was that...
people of colour, it's obvious they're discriminated against all the time. And
Yes.
she mentioned, I think, Jewish people, Irish people, travelling people.
Yeah.
It was a daft thing to say, but she did
It was
apologise.
Number 10 finally last night admitting that comments reportedly made, by a major Tory donor were racist and wrong.
Well, Frank Hester, who has donated £10 million to the Conservatives over the past year, is alleged to have said seeing Diane Abbott made him want to hate all black women and that the MP should be shot. He has apologised.
Obviously, you bear in mind what's happened to other politicians.
Yep.
That Derek Amos, and you think about that
David Amos.
David Amos and Joe Cox as well. Still with us, Talk TV reporter Victoria Niss. That's not altogether right, because she hasn't been here for an hour. We're also joined by former Conservative advisor, a man who could put a smile on anybody's face, Charlie Rowley. Good morning. The Dream Team are in. Can we just have some facts, Vic, to start with you? Because Kelly Badenoch came out yesterday, was quite forceful, and suddenly Rishi Sunak follows suit.
Yeah, exactly. I think for Rishi Sunak, the pressure obviously was building all day yesterday, and the fact that he did not come out and say and even address the comments, let alone call them racism. Obviously, Kemi Badenoch, as you say, this is a woman who stood up in front of the Conservative Party last year and said that Britain was the best country to be black in. And then for this scandal, this race row to engulf the Tory party this week, it wasn't a good look for the Prime Minister. His spokesperson then came out late last night and finally called it racist and wrong. And as we head into today, and obviously PMQs at 12 o'clock, he would have been under immense pressure if he hadn't have come out and condemned it. Now, of course, as you say, the questions will turn to that £10 million, whether the Tory party should return that money. And that is something which he will undoubtedly get asked upon midday.
Charlie, the Labour Party has often been accused of having an anti-Semitism problem. Do you think that the Tory party has got a racism problem?
No, I don't. That's not been my view. That's not been my experience within the Tory party. I think the difficulty yesterday was that the comments were unverified up until, and I think they still are unverified. Now, that's not to say that they've been denied. I think people have contacted Mr Hester and he hasn't denied them, and he's obviously apologised, so therefore admitting those comments took place. But I think whether, at the time, whether they were racist, whether they're not, did they happen, did they not, there was a bit of confusion yesterday morning. But when you have Kwasi Kwarteng, obviously a black former Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Conservative Party, when you've got Kemi Badenoch calling these comments racist, which they were, which they are totally unacceptable.
And
They're
the first
totally
British Asian
deplorable.
Prime Minister couldn't see that until two of his cabinet ministers, who happened to be black, came out and said it.
Well, he, I think, described them as unacceptable, and obviously had spokespersons sort of...
God, the optics.
But you're absolutely right. You've got to call it out for what it is when you see it, whatever the political party.
I don't think he has...
racist.
This is my argument about Sunak. I don't think he has that... I don't think he's a conviction politician. I don't think he's somebody who ever goes out on a whim. I think it's all about focus groups and what... Kemi Badenoch came out and called it what it was. I don't like Diane Abbott in any which way, but when you think of what happened to those two MPs, you can't go around saying, whether you hate somebody or not, I think I would prefer to shoot them. It just doesn't happen. What happens, though, with Sunak is, because he's deemed, I think, a bit of a dither, and I know, after Bojo, who would jump before he even thought about it, he's surrounding himself with these problems, Charlie, that won't go away. Freddie said earlier, Freddie from The Spectator said, Freddie Gray, probably the reason that he was a little bit reticent was because he knew that the £10 million donation would come up. But it was going to come up anyway. And it just, to me, is another mess.
Yeah, well,
through his incompetence.
Well, and I think, look, we could have heard from anybody yesterday. We could have heard from the party chairman. We heard from other sort of cabinet ministers. But Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, might have thought, OK, the terrible comments, but I've got a job to do today. But you're absolutely right. Look, whatever the problems in this country, Diane Abbott is not the solution.
No.
She herself has lost the Labour Parliamentary Party whip because of comments that she's made in the past. So,
absolutely.
In relation to anti-Semitism.
Let's make that point quite right, Nick.
Exactly so, but that absolutely does not justify in any way, shape or form the comments that have been made against her for precisely the reasons that you were just saying, Jeremy, because two MPs have died, lost their lives because of violence. And
why can't Sunak, in his core, on his own, in his room yesterday, go, I'm calling this is unacceptable. For me, he waits for focus groups, he sends out his cabinet ministers, and by the day, he looks out of his depth. I genuinely believe that.
I think it is also genuinely because he fears losing a certain demographic who would not think that these comments were racist and might not want to vote for him and might vote for other parties because he'd come out and called these things racist. Unfortunately, I think that's a a sad indictment of the society that we live in. But Victoria, another leader has come out and condemned these comments even further, Humza Yousaf, saying that actually not only were they racist, but they were inciting violence.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Diane Abbott herself commented yesterday and she said that she felt frightened. She said that she was alarmed by the comments and she said she already felt insecure walking home in her constituency in Hackney as a single woman. And obviously, as Charlie's been saying, there's been a lot of talk recently about violence against MPs, about safety of MPs. It was something that, you know, at the beginning of this month, Rishi Sunak came out and stood outside Downing Street and talked about extremism. And he said, you know, he condemned hatred and he even mentioned the fact that MPs feel unsafe in their own homes. And then to have this row come up and take over the Tory party this week, in a week that they wanted to start by talking about extremism, they wanted to have the narrative themselves. It is a big problem for the Tory party.
Diane Abbott isn't out of the headlines, of course, because it dominated PMQs today. And it's all down to that big question, should the Tories give the £10 million back, the donation from this chap called Frank Hester? And in fact, the more you look into Frank, I mean, he's got a little bit of previous on, shall we say, unconventional terminology.
Yes, it seems like Frank does like to push the envelope in his sort of humour.
Yeah.
Somewhat sort of 1980s. Clearly, he's admitted that it was wrong. The government now has been forced to admit it was racist and wrong. And so then what do? Clearly, we have to remember one thing. Shock horror, Labour and the Liberal Democrats would quite like the Tories to lose £10 million. They would quite like to bankrupt their opponents if they could.
Almost a third of what they're allowed to raise for an election campaign.
Completely. And so then the PM was right to point out, though, that if you go through the list of every other sort of supporter and acolyte of all sort of sides, they had this particular rant at Keir Starmer about how, we must remember Angela Rayner calling people scum and all the rest of it, and, what about sort of these people, these Jeremy Corbyn, try to make him Prime Minister and all these sort of things. So if you go, I think it's this thing where, at the moment, the only sensitive bit, really, is whether the Tories then do feel they need to hand back that money. Because, yes, as I'm saying earlier, you can lose it in the rough and tumble, pointing at the rogues gallery across each party. But at the same time, Frank Hester has clearly learned that when you become the Tories' biggest donor, it invites a lot of scrutiny and a lot of brickbats. Yes, you get the flattering interviews with people wanting to know why you think Rishi Sunak is so great, but you also get the criticism, and The Guardian are desperate to try and find some way to come at you.
Can they not... I mean, I don't know whether Frank Hester is a member of the Conservative Party. He's a donor. Assuming he's a member, can they not just kick him out as a member and make sure that he or his company are never given any contract again? Can they do that? Because he strikes me, this guy, because, I mean, what he said was, as everybody, I think, now agrees, yesterday quite a lot of ministers didn't want to say it out loud, and then the Prime Minister's office said, Rishi Sunak thinks it's racist, and Kemi Badenoch had said it's racist, and, looks like a duck, sounds like a duck, and all the rest of it. He had some curious defences over this, but he strikes me as sort of a bit of a Boris character in some respects, in that there is a contingent of, and they're mostly sort of 50-year-old white blokes who, because they don't ever see or experience racism, they kind of think it almost doesn't exist. So by making jokes or saying silly stuff is fine because they're not a racist, so they can get away with saying it. Now, that doesn't really work, but that's the only way I've ever been able to try and get into the nuts and bolts of the psychology of these people. Is that, really?
I think it's David Brent has a lot to answer for.
It's Brentian in that respect. They think, well, what's the big deal? I'm not a racist, so I can say it.
You're
can't.
Owning racism to make a point.
Correct. All of that. Yeah.
This is the thing. There's a subtle tension here where he's made clear he doesn't believe the remarks are racist, but he's just apologised for them. The government now has been forced. Kemi Badenoch led the way in saying they were. And at the same time, there's the extra dimension where... So there's an interesting part of your questions where you have to pull apart the fact of, well, you can condemn the man, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to ban the business from ever doing anything for the government.
The world's biggest albatross has just been placed around the neck of the Tory party. The scandal of their donors' remarks, which the Prime Minister has finally called racist after sending junior ministers out to say they weren't, has sunk to a new level. Inside sources have told the papers this is the last straw for Sunak, and the no-confidence letters are starting to tumble in through Sir Graham Brady's letterbox. Is this the end for Sunak's wet-fused premiership? Here's what Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer had to say.
the highest tax burden since the Second World War. I did listen to the Chancellor, £46 billion of unfunded commitments. They tried that under the last administration and everybody else is paying the price. And 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister promised to crack down on those spreading hate. Today, he shrunk at the first challenge. Last week, he promised fantasy tax cuts. Now he's pretending it can all be paid for with no impact on pensions or the NHS. All we need now, Mr Speaker, is an especially hardy lettuce, and it could be 2022 all over again. Is it any wonder that he's too scared to call an election when the public can see that the only way to protect their country, their pension and their NHS from the madness of this Tory party is by voting Labour?
Well, he wants people to vote Labour. He would ask them to do anything. Funnily enough, tonight, the Labour Party actually put out a fundraising cry to all of their members using this £10 million donor as an excuse, but there we are. Joining me now, we've got the panel here. Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant is here as well. We'll come to you guys in a moment. Madeline, you were probably in the Prime Minister's room this afternoon when Prime Minister's questions were going on. It got a bit vitriolic. All sorts of accusations flying backwards and forwards. It's now getting to the point where, you know, racism, Islamophobia, as we were saying last night, is now the order of the day, instead of all of the things that actually are really wrong with the country.
Yes, it does increasingly feel like PMQs is 35 minutes of every week where it basically consists of the two main parties pointing at each other and saying, no, your party is racist, no, your party is racist. And that's not to excuse the, you know, outrageous racist remarks made by the Tory donor or any of the other scandals that have erupted over the last few weeks, but it feels like we're always in mudslinging mode, and the issues of real substance facing the country, these are just too difficult to discuss. So we go back to the mudslinging. Right. And I mean, perhaps 'twas ever thus, but certainly it feels like this is the new order of the day at PMQs more than in any time that I've been sketching it, certainly.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, I mean, Starmer spent a long time having a go at Rishi Sunak. Let's see what Rishi Sunak had to say. Finally, back to him. I think we've got that. Have we got that? Go on.
The alleged comments were wrong, they were racist, and he has now, as I said, the comments were wrong, they were racist. He has rightly apologised for them, and that remorse should be accepted, Mr. Speaker. There is no place for racism in Britain, and the government that I lead is living proof of that.
I mean, quite clearly, he wasn't advocating killing anybody. The argument that goes against that is that, well, you know, we live in a world where, you know, MPs are quite vulnerable right now, whether it's somebody protesting outside their house or whether it's somebody turning up at their surgery with a knife, and we've seen that happen in recent times. The counter to that, however, is then, well, OK, so you shouldn't say that because it's not responsible and it could be dangerous. What is the list, then, of things you can say? Well, I mean, once you get into that territory...
It's a good question.
We're all gagged, aren't we?
Is the Conservative Party's biggest donor potentially a target of their extremist legislation? So again, I would go back to the point that people have got to be free to make jokes, whether we think they're good jokes or bad jokes. I knew David Amess. What happened to him was unquestionably a tragedy. I think MPs probably do need more security protection in that regard. And as I say, terrorism needs to be clamped down on very heavily. But terrorism and violence are very different to holding views that are unusual or telling bad jokes.
Yes, and one is forced to, I think, reasonably conclude that if nobody ever said anything bad about an MP, every now and again, some horrendous character is still going to want to do something awful to an MP. Yeah. So we're in that territory.